Welcome, everyone, to our discussion on addressing inequities in higher education post-COVID. Today's event is hosted by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Department of Science Education. Hhmi is a science philanthropy whose mission is to advance basic biomedical research and science education for the benefit of humanity. The unprecedented challenges of a pandemic and important calls for racial justice have placed new demands on higher education institutions. That has magnified disparities among students across ethnicity and across class. Our discussion will explore the persistence of deep-rooted inequities and will probe how the system might repair them. We will have two conversations with national leaders in higher education, each moderated by a prominent journalist. We're grateful to today's diverse audience, which includes hundreds of faculty and staff from university campuses across the country, prominent journalists who cover higher education, and Hhmi leadership and staff. A couple housekeeping notes. Questions are welcome. Please use Zoom's Q&A button. And these proceedings are being recorded. Now, without further ado, it is my honor to introduce the moderator for our first panel, Goldie Blumenstick, senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Goldie, please take it away.
Thanks, Richard. Equality of educational opportunity is a persistent, pervasive, and patently false American myth. That sounds like something that could have been written by one of our two guests today, Tony Carnevale, whose new book, The Merit Myth, is subtitled, How Our Colleges Favor the Rich and Divide America. But actually, it's a quote from a report that I read 8 years ago, a report that includes a statistic that has actually stuck with me ever since. That statistic is that basically an average 24-year-old born in the top quartile of our country by income is 7 times as likely to have earned a BA by that age than someone born in the lower quartile. 7 times as likely. The same year that report came out, 2012, the Century Foundation organized a whole task force, and its goal was, the title of its goal was keeping America's community colleges from becoming separate and unequal arms of American higher education. And many of its recommendations have yet to be implemented. So yeah, the problem of socioeconomic stratification in higher education is not new. It's not just about individuals, it's also about institutions. And it's not just about economics. These stratifications are racial and ethnic as well. Consider this one statistic from a 2018 report from Education Trust, a group that I turn to a lot when I'm trying to understand inequalities in higher education today. 47% of all adults have either a BA or a community college degree right now, associate's degree. But if you look at that by race, the percentage for Black adults is about 31%, and the percentage for Hispanic adults is about 22%. And at the BA level, if you look at those divides, the disparities are even worse. Today, I'm really delighted to be having Tony Carnevale from Georgetown University's Center on Education and the Workforce. And shortly, when we get past a few technical glitches, Kelly Mack, who heads the Kaleidoscope Project from at the American Association of Colleges and Universities, to be exploring with us some of the causes of these inequalities and inequities, and also talking about some of the ways that you and others might be able to push your institutions and some of your policymakers to make some changes in the ways that things might work. Now, there's a lot of ground to cover, and my thought is to sort of start by sort of looking at where these inequities begin, which is not necessarily in higher education, but probably pretty much at birth, and we'll sort of carry that through. But before I sort of take this sort of chronological look through the problems of inequality in higher education, I thought I'd start with Tony, and hopefully Kelly will hop on shortly. Tony, what are you seeing right now in the economy, in the pandemic economy that we're facing right now, that's got you most worried about sort of the trajectory of inequality in higher ed?
Sorry about that.
No worries. We're all sort of dealing with, after all these months of Zoom, we're still getting our sea legs here.
And thanks for showing my book. You're kind. The coronavirus pretty much exposed America's race and class problems. It made them worse in the short term, especially as it affects higher education, because we know something we didn't know a decade ago, and that is the fact that fewer and fewer minorities have access to higher education in this environment, or have access to completion, which is an even deeper problem, means that their careers will be scarred by that. We know for all the annoyance with millennials, which I don't share, millennials are the first group of Americans to come out into what is essentially a new world in which you have to get some college to get a good job, except for 20% of high school graduates, and virtually all of those are male. So for women, you have to have at least some post-secondary. And we know that for these recent generations, the collapse in the collapse in the technical economy prior to the Great Recession, the collapse of employment in the Great Recession, and now they've taken one more body blow with coronavirus, that they have been and will be even more impacted by difficulties in the transition from youth dependency in economic terms to adult economic independence. And we've now seen that stretch from what it was back in the old days when I was young. It was when I came out of college, it was age 25 when most Americans, male and female, reached what economists thought of as the age of independence, which is the age at which you achieve the average wage for your gender, knowing that the differences by gender, male and female, were great. But that age used to be 25, and now it's 32, and now for millennials, the newest number, which is as of a month or so ago, and we ran these data again, is age 34. And I expect it will move again. And within that number, there are very different trajectories by race and by class. In the case of race and class, we know that many, a fairly substantial proportion of low income and minority students don't make it, or they make it and then fall back, and then make it again and fall back. That is, make that wage level. So
do you see what's happening now making it harder for them to make it and fall back?
In the end, what we've really done is, I think, although the recessions and the economic calamity argue that there may be more economic impact than I think, but I think underneath all this, we've basically built a new stage in the life cycle, and that we are completely unprepared to make the transition from youth to adulthood in ways that we used to. It was very easy at one point. I think that there's a structural change in that transition that has been going on since the early 80s. And a lot of people aren't making it. And those who fall backward, that is those who fall out of lower middle class status, many of them tend to fall out and not come back. A good 30% do. That is, a good 30% will climb back up again, mostly through work experience, not education. But part of what's going on, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to say, I see Kelly has joined us. So I want to get her in on this question as well. Kelly, thanks for joining us. I was just asking Tony, as we look at the impacts of the pandemic, looking at enrollments and things like that in higher ed, what sort of worries you the most about what you're seeing right now from the results of impacts of the pandemic on how it might affect some of the systemic inequalities that we all know are already sort of in the system?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Goldie, and thank you to everyone. My apologies for being late. Just a minor glitch. I'm happy to be here. There are lots of things that are worrying me, and I think probably the biggest one, and I'm sure we'll talk about others as we go along, but the biggest one is the way we've contextualized the argument, even that the issues that we are facing are the result of COVID and not being exacerbated by COVID. They are the same issues that we haven't really fully dealt with before COVID. And I think that it does us an injustice to look at them in terms of what has happened since March up until now, when we need just a longer span of time to look at what has happened in higher education, how we got here in the first place. It didn't just happen when COVID came. And like I said, there are other things that are worrying me. I worry about our not centering issues of race as we talk about higher education, as we talk about access, and as we talk about equity in higher education, especially in the STEM disciplines. There is just no escaping the fact that racism plays a significant role in the kinds of issues that we're dealing with now, and that it is not improving and cannot improve until we start to confront that as a major factor in higher education, particularly in STEM.
Each of you, I want to sort of get to the trajectory of our conversation, but do you think the conversation has been too focused on what maybe people call class or socioeconomic issues and not enough about race and ethnicity? Have we missed, how much have we missed by just talking so much more about economics?
I do. In my world, I don't understand how we can separate the two. When we look at Black and Brown communities, Black Americans who make up about 12% of the population, and about 20% of the people in our country who are at or below the poverty level. Maybe I should say at or below the poverty level. And the same for Hispanics. I don't find that socioeconomic status can be a proxy for race, that at the core of that is how we treat individuals in this country based on what race they come from.
Tony, you've done a lot of work on both race and class and economics. Do you think?
Well, there is a, truth be told, higher ed does better on race than it does on class. That is, there are substantial shares of African Americans, Latinos, and if you throw in Asians, it gets bigger, but African Americans, Latinos in selective colleges. But the class-based response in higher education just isn't there. That is, in 1994, about 5% of the kids in the top 500 schools were from the bottom 25% of the income distribution. That share has increased to 7%, which is less than half of the minority participation in elite education in the United States. So for a variety of reasons, we've never dealt with class. Race is such a stark issue in American history that it has gotten some attention, although there hasn't been much effect from that attention. So that the two, in combination, the solution people think we're probably headed for, at least politically, is to find some compromise between the two, unless race gets taken out of the equation altogether by the Supreme Court, which that's always about to happen and never quite happens, but it gets whittled away at, that is, affirmative action gets whittled away at every time the court considers it.
So I guess some of that does come down to money at some level. We'll talk a little bit about that. I want to kind of get to my this trajectory, because obviously the inequities in higher ed don't start in higher ed. They start probably at birth. They start at where people live. They start in elementary schools and preschools. So maybe the free college discussion should be the free preschool discussion. But I guess from both of you, I'm wondering what could happen at the K, you know, before 11th grade for students. What could higher ed be doing to be sort of fixing some of the imbalances? I know it's not specifically where higher ed sees its role, but we know, if we know about all these structural problems that begin well before higher ed gets involved, are there ways that higher ed could be playing a bigger role? I'm thinking even about who becomes teachers or who becomes educators.
I don't think higher ed can or even should play a bigger role. I think that the conditions on the ground beginning at birth, and there are many numbers like the ones you quoted before. If you come from a family in the bottom quintile of socioeconomic status, income, your chances, and you have high test scores, you're in the top IQ scores in many cases, top half of your grade school class, your chances of getting all the way through college and getting a good job at age 28, which is where the data leaves us, are about 30%. If you're a young person who is in the bottom of the test distribution, and you come from a family in the top quartile of economic status, socioeconomic status, your chances of getting all the way through college and onto a good job by age 28 is 70%. So the issues here are fundamental. I mean, I do think that there's been a learning that is the shift in the intellectual conversation, and to an extent in the policy conversation, has been towards this notion of all one system. So that, you know, one of the lines politicians, at least some of them are using nowadays, is college graduation begins in preschool, and that's right.
Kelly, you were smiling there a little bit. I have a funny feeling that you don't necessarily agree nothing can be done or nothing should be done.
Well, that is true. But I was smiling because this question comes up a lot in our work in undergraduate STEM reform, right? And so, you know, college faculty point to K through 12 teachers. K through 12 teachers are pointing to parents, and everybody's blaming the mom. Exactly, right? And the womb and the pediatrician even. And so at some point in time, the question becomes, well, who is accountable? And I think that the mere fact that we in higher education spend so much time complaining about the quote unquote quality of students or the level of preparedness of students when they come in to college means that we must do more in the space of K through 12. So one of the things that frequently comes up when I hear, when there are mixed audiences of K through 12 teachers and college faculty, when the argument comes up that K through 12 is not preparing students for college, then we are often reminded of where those teachers got their education from. It was in college. And so, yes, we as faculty then must take responsibility for the kind of education that we provide for individuals who are going to go into the K through 12 system. That's one area where we can do more, especially in science and engineering. The lack of teachers who have competencies in math and science and engineering, there's a lot of room there for improvement. Second place, though, which has become just starkly obvious to me of late, is our capacity to function as citizens in this country. I don't think it's going to be acceptable for us as faculty to complain about the, again, quote unquote, quality or preparedness of students that are coming into college and vote for policies and policymakers who are not at the front lines or making strides in addressing some of those issues that Tony brought up just a moment ago about neighborhoods, about access to wealth, access to early start, or not early, pre-kindergarten, yeah, Head Start, that's what I'm trying to say, access to Head Start and the like. Those then become critical in determining the kind of student that arrives on our campuses.
So Tony mentioned tests and, you know, how the role that test scores play and sort of as a gatekeeper, and it's obviously really critical. A lot of colleges right now are talking about, because of the pandemic and because of, you know, difficulties in getting students into testing centers, going test optional. I'm wondering, will that change the dynamic a little bit in the admissions process? Moving up the funnel here a little bit on the time frame. Will test optional policies that colleges adopting, will it open more doors, make it easier for more students of different backgrounds to get into more selective colleges, or not? Tony, I think.
Well, my answer
You
is
looked at
not.
this a lot.
I
Your
used to
answer is
be
what?
vice president of the Education Testing Service. So I know the game, I know the business, and the business is a game. You should all know. In the end, what appears to be, what drives college behavior is their business model, except in very few instances where Harvard, where money doesn't matter. But in the vast majority of colleges, what drives their behavior is their business model. And truthfully, they believe they have no other choice but to exclude low-income kids. And I think they're right. The business model is one that ensures, even in the most elite colleges, you can't increase. We had a bill moving on the Hill, still up there, in which we were demanding that 20% of all admissions be kids who are Pell eligible. Very quickly, colleges demonstrated that that's impossible without massive federal aid, and they're right. Even elite colleges are right about that.
Why are they right? Wait,
because, well, they're right and they're wrong.
Yeah.
I don't want to
because I don't think you think they're right.
No, they're not right. That is the fact that the business model does require they behave the way they do. But the that is, they would have to give up merit aid to relatively affluent middle class, upper middle class kids, which many of them, I mean, merit aid is massive in higher education. It's not really merit aid. It's just the few customers you get that'll pay full freight. After that, you got to figure out how you're going to give Johnny 10% and Mary 20% off, and you got to fill up your class. And then by the time you've done that, the money you have in hand for lower income kids, athletes, other kinds of students who have a special characteristic about them often ends up being, it's very small. And if you want to translate your merit aid, which is the only way to do this, into need-based aid, you're going to have to throw out 5 or 6 merit aid students to get one needy student. And that's just bad economics. So the business model is the culprit here. Taking away the test, and I think the evidence is that taking away the test does nothing. That is, taking away the test gives the colleges more authority and power in choosing students. And what they do, just as what they do as their endowment grows, by the way, is they admit more and more rich kids.
Kelly, do you see any
They want to
promise?
be autonomous in their admissions process so they can admit whoever they want, and they don't want anybody looking over their shoulder. So I think they're relatively hopeless unless we create we rebuild the business structure of higher ed, and we can do that in public higher education.
Kelly, do you see any promise for more equity in this period of test optional? And I think, and we're not even just talking about getting into college, but maybe even getting into graduate school. Anything that you think might change as a result of this? Or are you with Tony that in the end, it's a bit money talks more in this whole process than anything else?
So I kind of agree with Tony on this one. But I think that more is at play than the business model. I think that even if we looked at institutions where students, for the most part, are of middle, upper socioeconomic status, even at those institutions, we are finding that our Black and Brown students are not excelling. They are not thriving in the STEM disciplines. And so if the SAT were off the table and more students of color were admitted, there's still nothing there that says that we've dealt with some of the other issues or other barriers systemically that impede the success of Black and Brown students at any institution.
So you've got this miraculous way of leading me right to my next question is, what happens when the students get to college? Kelly, what are they, I mean, what are they seeing and what should they be seeing that they're not seeing now that might make a big difference for lower income students and particularly, but also for, you know, Hispanic students, Native American students and Black students?
Wow, that's a big question. And fortunately, I think fortunately, our students now are more vocal about what they are and are not seeing, what they want, what they need for their own survival, for their own well-being in college. They have taken to Twitter and they are telling us their stories. They're not seeing faculty that look like them. They are not even encountering faculty who have an earnest desire to see them succeed. They are still being weeded out at the freshman level. They are not seeing enough of themselves on especially larger traditionally white campuses. They are seeing the vestiges of centuries old systems and traditions and norms that were intended to exclude them from higher education. And these stories, although they are not new, the fact that they are still being told, and they're being told now in such public ways, and in such detail, is alarming in and of itself.
So obviously representation matters. And you've got experience also at HBCUs as a student. I wonder though, how far does representation go, or models or mentors? Tony, you've written a lot about, the wealthier schools have more money and more resources and have a better record at graduating students than the lower resource institutions. At the end of the day, how much can be done with just better mentors or more faculty or people to look up to versus actual resources?
I think in the end, the differences in spending between selective and non-selective schools in public and private matters a great deal. Where it matters most is in student services and in counseling, I think. We have a system that we're running that will be increasingly accountable, but we don't have the counseling resources and student services resources in place that will allow them to improve on their performance. There's a missing link in all of this. I think it will come because the demand for accountability is very strong. And I think at this point it's unstoppable. So although we're in an awful spot at the moment because education, I mean, I'm very, don't sound like it sometimes, but I'm very much for it. We're in a bad situation because Biden won and he was going to come with lots of accountability and lots of money to leverage, including preschool, to leverage opportunity for minorities and low-income kids. But he had no coattails. So what we got is him, and that's it. So I don't see much movement on his education agenda, which I think really is, there's some parts of it I'm not crazy about, but his education agenda was the beginnings of a transformative agenda. So what we're going to get now in higher ed and in the rest of the system, which I don't know as well, is there's going to be some nasty medicine to swallow over the next decade for a variety of reasons, demography and other things that have nothing to do with policy as well. But policy is going to be tough medicine for higher education because of the move toward accountability. And there is, at least with Biden, he was all in on the medicine as Obama was. But at least with Biden, there was going to be money to help the medicine go down. I don't think there's going to be any money. It'd be hard medicine. So I think things like funding and that is institutional aid, which is the Biden Free College program allows for that. So I just think we're in a very bad spot at the moment, looking forward.
It seems like this puts even more pressure on what state policies and what maybe institutional and system policies. And let's talk about those for a couple minutes here. I'm wondering about, particularly maybe, this is actually a question that came in ahead of the seminar. Are there ways that colleges could do a better job of improving transfer and also helping students with their credentials? Like when they get a credential, helping students explain that more easily to an employer down the line so that people know what, on the accountability front, are there ways to make some of these credentials and these degrees more transparent to people so people understand what students are getting?
I think we almost have to. I think that the way in which trust has been broken between the public and higher education is a serious issue for us to overcome. I agree with what Tony is saying about accountability, but money or no money, there's still the question of accountability for what? And what are those metrics of accountability that we are going to look at? It is true, big institutions, big research intensive institutions, especially, graduate a lot of students, but they don't do better in graduating underrepresented or marginalized students. And so if we if we continue down this road of setting standards based on one particular institutional context and not taking into account that every institution is different, that every institution's mission is quite different, and that their goals are significant and also individualized, then we'll continue to replicate the same kinds of problems and complex issues to solve that Tony is explaining now. So I just want to come back to this. I don't think that the business model is the only culprit at stake here or at play here. And I don't think that money is necessarily going to be the answer to all things, that there are some other very complex underlying issues that must be dealt with. And at the core of them is race.
Someone asked a question ahead of the session about, they want to know 5 data points that you all might you think would be important for institutions to keep tracking to understand how they're doing on, solving some of these inequalities and some of these inequities. Maybe you don't have 5, but could you mention a couple, each of you, that things that would be good measures of, effort? Maybe it's race related and ethnicity related stats, keeping stats more by some of those numbers rather than just overall numbers. But what do you look to when you want to sort of measure success on these attainments?
So we get that question a lot from STEM faculty. We get it a lot, particularly at our institutes. And everyone is very anxious to move forward, especially in diversifying STEM and recruiting and retaining diverse students and diverse faculty. And what we repeatedly say, and it bears repeating here again, there is no magic list. There are no magic metrics that get you from point A to point B. What's necessary is that every institution, every department, every college take the time to understand what is important to them, examine what is keeping them from getting to what they are saying is important to them, and how they want to hold themselves accountable for that. It is impossible for us to say across the board that every institution ought to count the number of women faculty. And I bring up women faculty because of my experience with the advanced program at NSF. Excellent program, lauded all over the world for what it does to advance the careers of women. And many of our institutions, advanced institutions, count success as the number of women faculty that they've been able to either recruit and or retain. The danger in that, and that's wonderful, but the danger in that is that we overlook what happened with or what's happening with women of color. We're overlooking, sidestepping what's happening between early career, mid-career, and late career women faculty. There's so many other nuances. So just saying that we've increased or an institution has increased the number of women is not nearly enough if the goal was to change the culture of the institution in a way that made it, for instance, family friendly for women or for all faculty. So I always stop short of anything that would suggest that this kind of work can be done or achieved through a specific specified list of activities or measures that we have to have, that we all have to have.
Context is everything.
Context matters.
Tony, any thoughts on that?
I don't, there are an ideal set of metrics, and obviously they include race and class. But that's not what's going to happen, I think. It's pretty clear that from the policy side, which is, I don't think higher education will ever change from within because of the business model. So I think the changes will come from the outside, and I think they'll come from politicians. And what politicians are about, federal and state at the moment, and in both parties, is accountability. Now, it begins with cost. That is what drives it in their relationship with their constituents. But it also begins with outcomes. That is what's about to happen is that we're going to be able to hold higher education accountable, or at least make higher education very transparent, I think, with respect to two consequential outcomes. One is completion, because higher ed can't duck that one. They've already sort of agreed to it. And then the other one is employment effects, earnings. And those things are coming. The issue will be to what extent will earnings, and the other thing that's profound in this change is that it's not about institutions. It's about programs. So there's a general agreement that we need to shift the governance and regulation of higher education away from institutions and towards programs. What a lot of people believe is that, at least in the public system, not the private one, but at least in the public system, because they are state systems, at least in theory, so that you can govern those systems for efficiency and outcomes, which means more specialization. But in the end, the shift from institution to program is, I think, the profound thing that higher education really hasn't dealt with yet. So that, and then of course you need a counseling system to deliver that information to students. And then the issue is which programs will be subjected to gainful employment regulations. I think in the end, those will be the training programs, or the programs that have a most obvious connection to a particular occupation, and those tend to be sub-baccalaureate.
I can see a lot of America right now just kind of cringing at the notion of that, though, of judging all of higher education based on maybe how much money a major or a certificate produces.
But you won't be, this is first of all, the economic value of higher education is very complicated. That is, you can get a little specific education. You can get a certificate in heating, ventilation, and air conditioning and do a lot better than 30% of BAs and a fair number of graduate degrees in counseling, social work, and education. But the other reality is that in any field that has an attainment hierarchy, so let's say computers, the most well-paid curriculum is the one that combines, that leads to a BA. That is the combination of high-value specific education, which is the characteristic of STEM, and high-value general education produces long-term earnings much better than specific alone. And then especially if you get even more specific education by going on to graduate school, that will leverage your earnings some more. So but in the end, the only way you can understand this, or a student can, is program by program.
But right now what we're hearing, I mean, I'm not even out and about, but even just coming through my computer, all I'm hearing is right now, we got to get people back into work. We got to get people new skills. And it's all this kind of like a short-term approach. And higher ed was already kind of moving into that sort of micro-credential notion already. But both Kelly and Tony, how do you make sure that students, these don't just become dead ends and become sort of, the 21st century version of tracking, which basically creates more inequities in the system than we've ever had before?
Good question.
I think it's a good question too. I don't know.
I mean, it's something AACU worries a lot. I hear that a lot from the folks at Kelly's organization, because they want, and it also ultimately may be important to some of the values that you talked about early on about, helping people become sort of broader citizens and not just specialists in their field.
But, I think we're definitely going through a period, and it's gotten very intense, as you may know, over the last 6 to 7 months. Everybody's railing against the training bills on the Hill, in many cases for good reason. So, but we're about to shift to training. There's no doubt about that. You can't—
Away from education to training?
Well, there's going to be a lot more training. I don't know if it's away from education. I don't think so, frankly. But I do think we're about to shift to training, because the truth is, if you go into the DNA of this policy conversation, the real conversation has been since Jimmy Carter. How do we build an effective education and training system? We tried to build the training system out of the Department of Labor for a while. We're going to build it in the education system. So education's about to get a lot more training, and some of which is going to be pretty hard to figure out the value. 5-week courses. I don't know how you get an earnings return out of that. But yes, training is coming to stay. And in the corona virus environment, you got to be nuts as a politician to vote against it.
What about—
I think it's built in as we go forward, but and I don't think it's a bad thing, but the tracking issue is very powerful, especially now after this election.
What do you mean by powerful? It's coming, or we need to fight it?
It's already here. That is, we took the tracking in K-12 education, higher education, took that tracking, hid it underneath things like the glossy scientific glow of the SAT, and move that tracking into the higher ed system. And then we push it out into the labor market, and then it starts all over again in terms of jobs people get, schools their kids get to go to, and where they live. So there is higher ed is a very highly tracked set of institutions. It's become ever more highly tracked since the early 90s. And one thing that's interesting at the moment is if Biden had gotten his way on free college, I think we'd have had a shot at this. I don't think he's going to get his way.
Free college dead? What do you think? With this Congress, is free college dead? And free college meaning first 2 years, probably.
I'm assuming free college meaning 4, which I think is the consequential piece. If we end up with what everybody calls 14 is the new 12, that's already happening in the States. We're going to have a tracking problem that's huge. The only way out of it, I think, is we've got to let community colleges give BAs. And in the public system, we've got to demand that some percent, the number I use, but it's just a number I use, is that we ought 20% of public college admissions need to come from community colleges every year. That is in the third year.
So you're getting to my transfer question. Kelly, what do you, where you see any ways to, I want to talk about transfer, and then I want to quickly talk about adult students and one more projection about the Biden administration, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. So quickly on transfer,
Oh,
Kelly.
Sure. So, but I wanted to just jump back for a second and go to your question on where we ended up with tracking of programs, because I think Tony is right, but we can go back even further than the 1990s to like the mid 1900s when the decision was made that this nation was going to bolster its work in the STEM disciplines, and the National Science Foundation was funded to do just that. And there were a small set of institutions that it started with, that it funded, and those institutions are still STEM, science and engineering powerhouses even until today. So there is a history within higher education of attention being given to specific disciplinary areas, and those areas being well-funded, and our young people being directed, not even young people, but also I'm thinking about the GI Bill, and our veterans being directed towards certain disciplines that met a need for the country. And this is certainly, I think, one of those periods in time where we'll see that happen again. With respect to transfer students, and you're asking, is there much more that we need to do, or?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's also the top thing. The two things I'm hearing about right now are transfer and skills. Those are like everyone's number one agenda items, one and two.
It is, and you're right that my colleagues and I do bristle when we hear about programs that are geared just toward some kind of technical skill without developing the whole student, and some attention giving to being liberally educated. And we are looking at what is playing out in our country right now with the way the public does not respect or trust scientific evidence, for instance, and just the lack of critical thinking, leadership capacity, et cetera. And we point directly to that and say, well, you see, we need more liberal education in this country. And it couldn't be truer. But I think that there's a balance that we can strike. I think that there is a balance that we can strike between one being skilled in a technical area, and one also being fully liberally educated, and having expansive thoughts, and being able to hold space for disagreements and other perspectives and other viewpoints. To not have that is very dangerous for us. And we see that playing out now, like today, yesterday, almost hour by hour, we're seeing it play out. So to learn from our mistakes of the past would mean that we don't just have programs that are completely skills-based without adding some of the other kinds of skills that we know are essential to a healthy democracy. The ability to communicate, to be tolerant of difference and different perspectives, the ability to not just tolerate difference, but the ability to also think in new ways and be creative, work with teams, be collaborative.
We've been talking a lot today, and a lot of the focus has been on, sort of the high school to college sort of transition and then onward. But obviously higher education is not just for young people. It's increasingly, at least a quarter of the students, even in undergraduate programs today, are older students. And I feel like sometimes when we talk about even the systemic inequities in higher ed, we don't really think about those older students in ways of policy changes that affect older students in a different way. Are there some things that we should be talking about today? Maybe this is even a good way to segue into my final question to you all, which is about the Biden administration, but the ways that we should be thinking about different policy approaches that are aimed specifically at adults.
I think it requires not just a policy change, but a culture shift. I think understanding the adult learner is a different animal than understanding the traditional learner. To go back to Tony's business model, where in higher education must have a number of registrants by a certain date, must report to iPads by a certain date. The adult learner who needs to show up in the middle of October, the adult learner who needs to work full time while going to class. Those are fundamental shifts in how we think about the delivery of coursework in higher education. Not all institutions, but by and large, those would represent fundamental shifts.
Tony?
The training agenda, while it will focus, to the extent it runs through the education system, it will focus on youth. There is a training agenda for adults. One of the questions that keeps coming up and talking about how that gets done is this tension between what in bureaucratic terms is the worldview or culture of the Department of Labor, the culture of the Health and Human Services Department, and the culture of the Education Department. And that is, we need training for adults. For the most part, for dislocated adults, we need training that moves them to a job. The earnings become secondary. And in social which means you can do training with relatively low earnings returns, which is very hard for educators to swallow. It means, I think, that the training industry will continue to grow, including the for-profits if the Republicans are smart. So I think and then there's the HHS view of the world, which is if you've got somebody who's on welfare, your first priority is to get them off. And you want to do that with training. Welfare reform went the opposite way and didn't work, made the job the primary goal. But training to a job that is increasing earnings, the social policy view is not the educator's view. So if everybody who's in the training program has to make the average high school wage, for example, then there aren't going to be any more nursing assistants, which is a huge occupation that is catered to by community colleges. Doesn't pay. But in those cases where jobs don't pay, there's eligibility for the earned income tax credit, eligibility one assumes for healthcare, food support, and so on and so forth. So educators are somewhat naive about social policy and job training policy, which is why I think the Labor Department, because it's the only way I can figure this out, is that Labor and HHS in Washington terms are going to remain important on the training agenda.
Right, so I think I'm going to let you all think about the Biden administration impact as sort of the background to some of the questions that might be coming in from the Q&A. So rather than explicitly talk about that now, I want you to keep some of that, incoming Biden administration perspective in your mind as I turn this back to Richard. And he's going to, I think, handle some of the questions that are coming in more directly during the chat. Is that right, Richard?
Yes, thank you, Goldie. And thanks to the panelists for your efforts so far. We've had quite an outpouring in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to some of the questions. Here's one. What role can federal agencies like the National Science Foundation and foundations like Aacnu, Hhmi, what role can they play to promote a greater sense of shared mission among different stakeholders, and the stakeholders being K through 12, community college, four-year institutions, Head Start, et cetera? How can we get them to see themselves as part of the same collective project?
Well, my bias about that one is only presidents and governors can do that. Now, if you go to the Congress, the chair of the full committee on the human resources or education and labor or whatever these things are called now, that person can do that, and so can the budget committees. One of the things that is most difficult about change in the American education system, especially as it relates to the economy, is that the whole apparatus is very siloed. So even foundations, right? So I get money from the Gates Foundation. They've got sort of a K-12 operation, a higher ed operation, and then they've got kind of an earnings and income upward mobility operation, and never the twain shall meet, even though they all have one boss. So it's a shift in perspective, and it's got to be executives, political executives who do this. I don't think the institutions themselves will do this. They have to be forced to do it.
I agree. I would not go so far as to say that at those levels, the individuals there don't see themselves as part of a larger ecosystem, that the mandates do come from above them with respect to the isolation or siloing of different programs and funding streams. And that then gets passed along to awardees. And going back to accountability, the way that awardees are expected to demonstrate progress.
Can I jump in for a second? It is about following the money, and the money directs things. There are different cultures, though. I mean, there's the K-12 culture and the higher ed culture, and those cultures don't cross paths much.
Except in the courts. There's one place where I think everybody's given up on that, and probably for the rest of my lifetime might as well. But the courts can have powerful impact on this, and that's still true in K-12. That is, you can still sue a state based on their inability, and there are many suits ongoing, suing states based on their failure to make people, their K-12 system to make young people college and career ready. Because politicians have long harangues about how they're doing that, and then you can sue them for it, because they're not.
So there's been quite an active discussion going on in the Q&A, and actually in the questions that came in advance of this webinar on the profound impact the pandemic has had on students of color, and some fears that professors have expressed about possibly losing the entire cohort. Now, realizing there are no silver bullets, I think a lot of people in the audience are looking for some guidance as to what universities, schools can do now.
Yeah, this question does come up a lot, and it's reminding me of a conversation that I had just recently with a colleague around this very issue. And the doubling of the time that it takes for her to prep her class, and the feeling that she is still not doing enough to ensure that students are walking away with the core knowledge and understanding that they need, and that they have to go on to the next level after this semester and after this year. And this extreme worry that the students that are coming to her next won't have even the fundamental understanding that these students had when they arrived in her class. And we had a conversation about what it will mean to cover 2 semesters of biology or 2 semesters of organic chemistry in the same semester, so that going forward, what we might be asking faculty to do is to do double time, to teach what was supposed to be taught in that semester and make sure students have the fundamentals that they were supposed to have gotten during this semester in particular, and next semester as well. I don't know what the answer is for now, other than what faculty are doing, what I see them doing, which is just struggling mightily to give students everything that they possibly can to ensure that they've got a fighting chance of going on to the next level and doing well. And that the kind of grace and compassion that we're asking them to extend to students at this time will have to be extended in the years to come. And in the conversation I had with my colleague, we talked about students in second grade right now. We talked about students in junior high school right now. And are they getting access to geometry and college algebra in ways that are going to prepare them to be college ready in the next 10, 15, 20 years? Maybe 20 is kind of extreme, but maybe in the next 10 to 15 years.
I don't think there's much, I mean, people can do in a situation like this is do their best.
Yeah.
It's survival time.
Yeah.
A lot of the niceties that come with normal times and the slack, the available money. I'm part of an elite college, university, and believe me, it's survival time. There's not a lot of room here except for extraordinary individual effort to do good. I think the political, it shouldn't be as bad as it is, but the political response has been, well, there hasn't been one.
I've been struck by the absence of particularly the number of students not enrolling in community college this year. That the first year students, I mean, that's like down like 18% or something. Yeah. And that's a confidence problem. That's that's not a lot. Colleges are ready to meet those students, but the students don't feel the confidence to be able to go right now because of all the anxiety, economic and health in their families. And so I feel like until that gets resolved on one side, those students are not coming back.
Well, for those kids, you got this recession is so different from the others in that regard. That is, in order to go to college, most people need a job, but there are no jobs and there are no colleges. So the old wisdom used to be, if you can't find a job or if the jobs are all lousy, if it's a recession, go to college. Where? So the young people today, the old formula doesn't work. I mean, they're hit on both sides. They can't afford to go to college because they can't work. And there's no college to go to anyway.
So the question of mentoring has come up during the conversation. And one question that's come in is, are there any data out there on how adjunctification, so faculty moving over to adjunct status, has impacted the availability of mentors through the longer term availability of mentors for students throughout their undergraduate careers?
I am not aware of any data, any national data that speaks to that particular issue. I can certainly understand how a preponderance of adjunct faculty could reduce the availability of mentors in any particular department, and then the ramifications and consequences thereof we're certainly aware of, particularly for marginalized students, and I'm also thinking particularly in the STEM disciplines as well.
We do know that there are strong effects from counseling, student services, and tutoring on individual student success. Now, to me, that's all the same. It's getting attention from somebody, which to me is mentoring. So I'm assuming that I'd be pretty surprised if the literature, I don't know, I've not seen anything specific to mentoring, but mentoring to me is getting somebody's attention and help. And to the extent we measure those things, yes, they absolutely do. They are in large part differences between affluent student success and low-income student success are explained by those variables very powerfully. So yeah, I'm sure mentoring has a positive effect. It would be inconsistent with related research if it weren't true.
But they're not paying their adjuncts to be mentors. Their
No.
adjuncts are being paid to just teach that class, and they're not around. So There is
Well, and
probably,
you can't organize the adjuncts either. I can tell you that from a union point of view. They want nothing to do with the union.
I think colleges are trying to respond by creating peer-to-peer mentoring, but I don't know that it's of the same quality as a faculty mentor.
I don't know that it is either. It is a type of mentoring.
One point that also came up earlier, the need to diversify STEM faculty in particular. The question is, are there programs out there that seem to be succeeding? Person asked about the AAAS Sea Change program, for example. Can you point to success in this area?
Well, I have one statistic for all that, which I hope is right because I looked it up before we went on. And that is in 1977, 3% of engineering graduates were Black. In last year, in 2019, it was 4%. So I have been in more meetings and seen more grants given, NSF and all those folks. They have whole offices that deal with this stuff. And apparently it isn't working.
We're all looking
Hard
at
to
Kelly. 'Cause
follow
the world.
that. It's just so gloom and doom. I cannot point to any specific example. Tony is right that a lot has been done. A lot of investment has been made to diversify STEM faculty. And what we are learning is that on one hand, the solution is as simple as hire them. And it is as complex as what is the hiring process that has served as a barrier for their being hired. So when we're asked this question about, are there institutions that do well at it? Absolutely. Absolutely, they are. And those are the institutions that are clear about why they want diverse faculty in the first place. And they have done the work of upending their systems and traditions and norms in ways that have produced the kinds of outcomes that they want to see with respect to diverse faculty. So where there are institutions that are struggling, by and large, what we're able to do is to point to some assumption that has been made about why diverse faculty would never come there or why they don't do well there. And those assumptions have gone unchallenged and unchecked. We are also able to point to really specific policies that are governing how faculty are recruited and how they are treated once they are in a specific department, both for faculty from marginalized groups and also for women in the STEM disciplines. So I don't know that it is hopeless. I think that the easy part of the work has been done, which is to just look at numbers or to just produce more. The more difficult work, though, of looking beyond the surface and going underneath to our implicit biases and underlying conflicts and biases about faculty of color, that more difficult work is where we are right now.
We have a few minutes left in this first panel. I'm going to hand the reins back to Goldie to pose her question about the incoming administration and then wrap up.
Okay, great. Okay, you guys have been appointed to the new Biden transition team on, it doesn't exist, but it's the one about resolving longstanding systemic inequities in higher education. What are your top 3 priorities for the Biden transition? Well, let's go with Kelly first and then Tony.
Okay, top 3 priorities. I think I would start with racial reconciliation. I think I would also probably, wow, there's so many places to go with this. I
You want to
would.
go? Do you want to trade off one from Tony, one but
Okay,
the other
yes.
back?
Let's
Okay,
trade off.
we'll go one for Tony now. You get one.
I would say free college. But then they tell me that we're not going to do that. So you can either come up with a new idea or leave the meeting. So
Right.
I would say reprioritize funding in such a way that we are rewarding those institutions like our HBCUs and tribal colleges who do the brunt of the work in graduating Black and Brown students in STEM.
Tony, we're back
I
to
would
you.
say all that, and I can't remember specifically, but there are at least 6 items in the platform that address that specifically and with very substantial sums of money. And then, although in that case, for reasons I don't completely understand, that tends to be a bipartisan agenda. Well, I would say maybe that stuff doesn't go away. Maybe that stuff or some of it survives.
And Kelly, your last one, mindful also that we probably have a Republican Congress, and which is probably going to be a little less generous financially towards a lot of things, and that's going to have a ripple effect to the states.
Oh, well, that just messes it all up, Goldie.
Well, you know, reality has a way of doing that. All right, go for your dream one, and then we'll crush your dreams later.
Okay, my third one, which is very personal to me, would be that we reinvest in faculty as being essential to higher education. That we reinvest in their development, in their well-being. That we see them as being core to the function of the institution.
You know, I think it's going to be a really hard one to accomplish given what's happening financially, but it's all we hear from at the Chronicle, you know, how much faculty have been working, how much they've been, as you know, they're struggling in this pandemic too. They're not just dealing with it, they're experiencing it themselves. And the mental health and mental well-being of faculty members is a very high priority right now. I think that issue is not going away. Tony, your last transition.
The other, I mean, again, I go back to the platform and get away with that for at least a month, and that is increase funding substantially for building the technical capabilities of minority serving institutions. That was one that, frankly, I didn't see coming in the deliberations over the platform, but there were a lot of people who did, thankfully. I think that's a real issue with minority serving institutions, is their technical capability and research capability. So I would, in this particular arena, I think that would have been a very good idea.
I'm going to throw in broadband, broader broadband for everybody, because I think if anything else, that affects higher ed, it affects communities, it affects everything else along the way. That some of those things that can't happen at the K-12 level right now without broadband, and I think even post-pandemic, it's become evident that that's a critical piece of infrastructure that the country needs. Maybe also bipartisan.
The one other thing, let me just mention, because it was in the platform, and I keep saying this platform thing because I think the Democratic Party is the party of higher education to a fault. It deserted working class Americans, especially African-American, minority working class Americans had nowhere to go but the Democratic Party, but the white working class left in a huff. And I think the one thing here that might be productive is there will be an infrastructure bill, I think, that's salvageable to the extent that Biden, had his constituency is higher education. That's the Democratic Party, but he is attempting to move back towards blue collar labor, working class people, and infrastructure is the temporary solution on that. And it seems to me, I don't understand why they can't get that. That will create, as we think, 15 million jobs over the next decade gradually. So that now, on the other hand, that's going to be stuff that requires high school plus a little sub-baccalaureate training for the most part. And it's going to be mostly male. So there is a shot at that. Then one other thing is The party will continue to carry these objectives, and one of them is what Biden did. He caved into the teachers on accountability, but his response was to triple the appropriation for what used to be called Title I. And that would have had a huge impact as well. That is, we would finally get, after the Supreme Court's failure in Rodriguez and in Milliken v. Bradley in Michigan to allow states to equalize spending across jurisdictions, that tripling of funding in K-12 would have just about done it in lower performing schools.
Richard, Infrastructure Week, it's going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I want to thank our moderator and panelists for this wonderful discussion that could obviously have gone on much longer. There's so much to talk about, but we do need to take a break now. For the next panel, we'll start at 1:15. Please stretch your legs, have a little rest. And apologies for not getting to all the questions, but there will be a second opportunity to pose more questions with the second panel coming up shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Welcome back to our discussion on addressing inequities in higher education post-COVID. A couple reminders. Questions are welcome. Please use Zoom's Q&A button. And today's proceedings are being recorded. We're having a little technical difficulty bringing our moderator, Anya Kamenetz, education correspondent at National Public Radio, into the webinar. But I'll take this moment to bring on our panelists and introduce them. First, I would like to say it's my pleasure to introduce Carol Christ, Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome, Chancellor Christ.
Thank you.
And President Michael Crow of Arizona State University. Welcome, Dr. Crow.
Thanks, Rich. Thank you.
And Sean Decatur, President of Kenyon College. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you all. And I see Anya Kamenetz has just joined us. Anya, I've introduced our panelists and glad to hand the proceedings over to you.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about the delay. Thanks for joining us for this amazing conversation. I'm so pleased to be joined by this illustrious panel of college leaders. And the discussion is about equity and who gets to come to the table. So it's kind of fitting that I had this moment of being locked out. There's always technical barriers that come to be an issue. And, you know, it's nobody's fault. It has to do with how systems are designed. But I'm joined here, of course, by Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State University, Sean Decatur from Kenyon College, yes, and Carol Christ, the Chancellor of University of California, Berkeley. And we got a lot of really great questions from attendees prior to this, but I really wanted to start by defining terms, because I think even in the last few months, we've all become so aware of the power of language to include and exclude. And so the opening question to each of you is, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean within your institution? How do you define it? And what metrics have you set, you know, because we manage what we measure? Does anyone want to take?
I'll jump in. So we've set the goal that our institution is not successful unless our student body represents the totality of the socioeconomic diversity of the population, and at the same time, the ethnic diversity of the population. So we consider ourselves a failure unless our student body is made up of those students. It is. It never was before. It is now. And also, unless we're able to roll and adjust. In our particular case, these three universities and colleges have different missions related and connected at the core, but different approaches. Ours is an approach of scale, where we're attempting to actually enhance outcomes across large numbers of people, because we have a very inequitable set of parameters right now. 50 years ago, when I was in high school, about 7% of people that came from the lower quarter of family incomes ever attained a college degree, and now it's all the way up to 8%. 50 years later, and the population is much larger than it was 50 years ago. So we have inequities also in the fact, and this is the last point that I'll make, in the fact that unless you're selecting only A students from high school, the graduation rates in American colleges and universities are declining at a rapid rate. More than half the people that have started in an American college or university have no diploma or no degree. The institutions are not designed for the range of diversity, so we have very inequitable outcomes. So we've set ourselves another goal, which we're not achieving yet, which is equitable outcomes across the spectrum of qualified students, where we have no differentiation based on incoming family income or based on any other social or economic variables. And so we're making huge progress towards that across a wide swath of the population, but we're not there yet. So that's how we measure equity in terms of our role as a democratically critical institution for democratic success.
I'd like to add to what Michael has said. It's interesting to me that those three terms represent almost a historical continuum. We began by talking a lot about diversity, which is essentially has a demographic measure. What's the composition of the students, the staff and faculty on your campus? Then we started talking about equity, which is of course different from demographics. It really has to do with how people are treated equitably. And then inclusion is really a different term, something we've started talking about more recently. I'd like to add two other terms to this set. One that we've started using at Berkeley a great deal from the Institute for Othering and Belonging that's led by John Powell, which is belonging. And belonging seems to me different from inclusion. It means that everyone feels that they have a right to be there. And the measure that we use at Berkeley is equity of experience. So demographics are a first step, but I don't think we've been successful unless all kinds of other markers, students' participation in education abroad, students' participation in STEM majors, students' participation in internships reflects the demographics of the campus.
And I'd like to build on Carol's comment, because I agree wholeheartedly that belonging is really I think the important evolution from a sense of inclusion. There are ways in which the term inclusion implies that there is there's an inner core to which others are being invited into to join, as opposed to creating a community in which there is true belonging, that everyone feels an investment and a fair sense of being part of the larger whole. And just to come back to your question, the important piece on metrics, which I think is worth dwelling on, I think that this last piece on how to cultivate a community that is characterized by a true sense of belonging is actually the hardest thing to measure. That we certainly look at diversity. The demographic piece is relatively easy to measure. Equity, we can look at outcomes, and we can look at sort of measures of experience, measures of climate and things to sort of get a sense of equity. Inclusion and belonging are the things that are much more, and we're still at least grappling with, how do you get a good sense of measurement of success and knowing that you have made it to the point, or you've made progress on that.
So let me, Anya, let me just pick up on a little bit of this, because I think that, the notions of inclusion and diversity and equity and belonging, they play in two dimensionalities. So one dimensionality is the internal workings of a university or a college community and making certain that all those things can be achieved. But then there's also the notion of the people outside that community who do not feel as if they belong in the community, who do not feel as if they could be included in the community. So I'm going to take Carol's comment relative to STEM, and you want to make sure that in your STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math, in your campuses, that they're much more open and warm, where you can have this sense of belonging and you can work your way in there regardless of your background, which is why we grew engineering alone from 6,000 students on campus to 18,000 students on campus, because you couldn't create the sense of belonging if you tried to do it within the existing number of seats. You would have to take people out. They no longer belonged. You had to expand. And so in our particular case, given our particular mission, the mission for us relative to the concept of belonging is that you can sense that if you go to the institution, you sense that you're connected to it before you're able to go to it. So we work on this tension between creating the environment of diversity, inclusion, and belonging inside the institution without creating a barrier exterior to the institution where there can be this connection to the institution. And some universities need to work on that, and some colleges need to work on that. Certainly we have had to work on that because we hadn't created that in the past, and we have created that now.
Yeah, I think I want to get back to that in a second. We talk about sort of changes in enrollment patterns, but there's a cluster of questions that came in. And of course, I had my question about how does the pandemic change your task? How does it change the constraints you're working under? And how has it revealed inequities that may not have been as apparent before? And how do you maintain your focus on equity, inclusion, belonging, diversity in this incredibly challenging environment? And President Decatur, I'll come to you first.
Sure. One thing I think that when reflecting on the past few months and navigating the COVID crisis, it has amplified and brought new attention on inequities that have been present in the system all along, but I think really brought them to the surface in ways that have become, both impossible to ignore, but also that have introduced new challenges. And one way that I've thought about this is the ways in which a small residential college like Kenyon is so much more than a provider of educational content, right? That we, for many of our students, especially our students who are coming from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, that they're looking to Kenyon as it's a provider of housing. It is a source for food security for many folks. It is a healthcare provider. It's a provider for mental health resources. There are many ways in which the institution is supporting students, especially supporting marginalized students. And the COVID crisis actually disrupted all of that. And one of the things that was striking in the spring was that delivering the education content in many ways, it was hard, but it was actually the easiest of those pieces to put together because, we had a sense of how to pivot things to remote teaching and learning with some difficulty, but figuring out how to do it. Figuring out how to support the mental health needs of students who are now scattered all over the country is much more difficult, especially in a climate where those mental health needs are getting exacerbated by the pandemic itself. And so, I think that this moment, and when you combine it with the reckoning with racial injustice over the course of since the death of George Floyd, we've had to begin to think more holistically about how our institution serves our students, and realize that we can't address things, even thinking about topics like addressing inequities in STEM outcomes and how we make our STEM classes more inclusive, that unless we put that in a larger context of these other features that have an impact on the lives of the students directly, we won't be successful.
Yeah, I very much agree with you, Sean. I one of the big learning experiences for me in the pandemic is I thought going into it, our big challenge was going to be remote learning. That is not the big challenge at all. It's really the mental health of our students, their sense of isolation, all of the social learning that's so much a part of college is so much more challenging for our students. But to your question, Anya, the pandemic has been this huge inequity amplifier. where it's just made so much more apparent, whether it's, poor internet connections, lack of a room to study in, responsibilities for taking care of siblings or for going to work because a parent has lost their job. It's made those inequities so much more both obvious and so much more of an impediment for our students. But I keep looking for the silver linings, and I really very much believe what Michael Crow was saying about scale, and scale as a way to solve the problem of access. And I think one of the things the pandemic has done is enabled us to imagine a kind of elasticity or flexibility of time and space, which is going to enable us to expand access. For so long, we've thought of higher education as 4 years, often between 18 and 22, in a particular physical place. And I think that the pandemic has helped us imagine a different paradigm, and one that I think is going to be much more welcoming to diverse populations in terms of race, ethnicity, but also in terms of age, amount of college credit.
I think I would just follow on what Carol said about this notion of elasticity of time and space. And so that's our hard learned lesson in the pandemic. And that is, we were already technologically very advanced here for a lot of different reasons. And what we found is that if we opened our minds up a little bit more, we could take the same assets, the library, the faculty, the other assets that we have within the university, and move in multiple directions to project out into the broader community. So we had 30,000 high school learners last semester. We have 300,000 this semester engaged in college courses and college readiness and moving people forward. We've been able to move into multiple modalities for teaching and learning that we didn't have before, reaching people that weren't reachable, helping families that were in economically challenged moments where we have many students that have gone home to be with their families to help them through the pandemic, but they're still students here, and they're still moving forward here. And we didn't think we could operate that way, but we now know we can operate that way. And we also know that we can project our faculty in multiple ways that we didn't realize before. And many of them are very interested in that. They're very interested in working in new modalities. So for us, the pandemic has been both very challenging, and here we are entering into yet another phase of this thing, which is very disturbing, but at the same time, unbelievably empowering to project the university. What Carol said, I like the phrase, elasticity of time and space. We can operate any time frame, any modality, any scale, in any location if we need to. And that's a very powerful thing. We never had things like that before. So
I want to follow on this paradox that I think we've all grappled with to different degrees of technology lowering barriers as well as raising barriers. And I wonder if you all have thoughts about, President Decatur, you talked about the issue of delivering mental health services, for example, potentially over telehealth, or even creating those relationships between faculty and students at a distance. And what I'm hearing you all describing is sort of a diffusion outwards of the university across the globe. You've got people that you're touching at a distance, but in a different kind of way. So how do you stop it from being, what I've always, what the research up to this point has said is that digital learning is a force multiplier for inequality. As much as it seems to lower barriers to access, it also makes it very difficult for all but the most self-motivated and most surrounded by support learners to succeed. So how are you all navigating that paradox?
Well, and thinking in terms of Kenyon, and Kenyon's a very different place than either Berkeley or ASU. When we think about scale, we are very rest on, or at least we present a particular type of relationship between students and faculty and students in the institution that is, where intimacy really matters, right? So this has been a challenge when when we have to reimagine what that intimacy looks like, that it can't be in person in the classroom, it actually has to look very different. And that's been, there's been a lot of things we've learned from that that have been quite powerful. One thing that I think I definitely need to comment on is that the technology itself is an issue, right? So that our students are in different places with different access to technology, and that those challenges are, they're very different depending on the geography. So we have a lot of students from rural areas where it doesn't matter how nice the technology you manage to get them, internet access is just not going to be great. And there's not, there's neither cellular service nor good other internet access. And, there's a real challenge there. And, we have students where we can get them the technology and we can help to make connections, but it takes sort of an investment of time and funds to make that happen. So, we are learning on how to make sure our students have the appropriate technology to be able to accomplish, and continue with their studies. At the same time, I think the crisis hit us in a way very different than I think if we were an institution that set out to develop relationships at a distance. And that is that for most of our students, they already had close relationships with each other and with faculty. So it's a question of how you translate those into a different mode as opposed to how you generate those up front. And what we found is that actually, and this comes back to, in a way, to this notion of elasticity in time and space, that's actually been a benefit for many students. I mean, we've actually found students who've appreciated the fact that, virtual office hours kind of work well because they are flexible on everyone's time schedule. And it's a way to move out of what was sort of a constrained sense of connections happening in particular places and at particular times. And I think we've learned to embrace that flexibility. Certainly the notion of the complementarity between asynchronous and synchronous connection, that those aren't really choices, but they're things that one can think of being suited to particular types of material and complementary in ways that can enhance everyone's learning, right? And that's something that I think we've developed a deeper appreciation of. And putting this all in the context of how do we make sure that the attention to differences in learning styles and differences in approaches to the material that a place like Kenyon values and kind of in-person education translates to a distance and remote environment? And I think the answer is it can, and it just takes intentionality and effort to make that translation. But I think we've learned how to do that. And now there's opportunity to think about how that changes the way we operate in the long term as well.
Now, that's so interesting what you said, Sean, because the thing we're really struggling with, the stories that we keep hearing, are about students that are isolated, that don't have the kind of networks that you describe as so much part of the liberal arts college experience with other students and with faculty. Whether these students are beginning students, lots of students at Berkeley are transfer students, or beginning freshmen, or just are isolated. And so they struggle with not having the resource that other people afford, peers, for when you hit challenging moments, whether those are in your classes or your life. And there also are some students that are just finding the remote modality of instruction just very difficult for them, that I keep hearing from students, I have so much trouble focusing. I just don't think I'm learning as well in through a screen, through these endless Zooms that we all do all day. So the ideal is to create some kind of social connectivity, but it's much more challenging than I had imagined it would be.
So Anya, I'll just say that I'm going to go to sort of a macro level relative to what you call the paradox. At the local institutional level, we raised millions of dollars and bought thousands of laptops and connections, and we just connected everybody that wasn't connected to the extent that we could. And if you couldn't get connected, then we created a unique solution for you. And so, we have 4,400 Native American students attending ASU from 225 Native American communities across the entire country. And so we're dealing with every type of situation that you can possibly imagine. We're building microwave towers to beam internet connectivity into areas of Metro Phoenix that don't have internet connectivity. So we're using every asset that we have to be able to make connection. But I want to just move it up one step. I mean, so what we're suffering in the paradox, this barrier to the access of technology, is a lack of leadership at the political level. It's a lack of leadership in our society. Who would not have, with rare exceptions, electricity or roads or water? 90 years ago, there were huge areas of the country when President Roosevelt was elected that had no access to electricity. They'd just been left out. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was created and systems were put in place. And lo and behold, those places have then prospered unbelievably since electricity was being delivered. Well, the internet is no different than electricity. There should be no gap. The internet should be ubiquitously available to everyone in the country for every reason: healthcare outcomes, educational outcomes, life outcomes, everything imaginable. And the fact that it isn't is yet another example. And I'm hopeful that President Biden and his crew will get in there and take care of this problem and solve it, because now we know the power. We can do telemental health, we can do telehealth, we can do teleeducation. You do not have to be cut off. And so the paradox exists, but it's a false paradox that's the result of bad leadership, and we need to fix it.
And if I could, just one thing to add on to that, I think the past few months have also just brought to the fore how a lot of outdated policy structures or various regulatory structures just get in the way. And mental health is a good example where telemental health actually turns out to be incredibly difficult across state lines, depending on the various state regulatory bodies. So for example, if you are an out-of-state student at Kenyon who has a relationship with a counselor at Kenyon, you can't work with that counselor if you are now studying remotely and living in New York or California. And so there's some ways in which, I think we need to rethink some very simple, basic structures to bring them up to date in terms of how we operate that just get in the way of what could be some really exciting possibilities.
I hear you all talking about the need for new thinking and new solutions. I mean, Michael, you're citing a historical analog, but this is really about it would be very bold new initiative to bring broadband everywhere. Do you all find that just as a side note, that the pandemic has enabled or necessitated more creative thinking about diversity and equity, or any other challenge that you're facing?
Yes, I think that it has, though it's not just the pandemic, it's also the political crisis and the crisis about systemic racism and social injustice that has accompanied the pandemic, together with an economic crisis that has hit so many parts of our country, so many parts of the economy so unequally, that I think we're all thinking very differently about inequities and social justice and what we can do as institutions to change that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated moment, mostly for the right reasons. I mean, we are taking another step forward in terms of aspirationally moving towards our unattained goals in the Constitution of equality and justice. These are very hard steps, and that's given us motivation and energy to move forward in new ways. We have the pandemic, which then thoroughly lays out the notion that we have a completely scientifically illiterate population at a level way beyond anything that I imagined, because they don't even understand the nature of the virus and its movement and how to protect against a 30 micron little RNA packet and those kinds of things. And so that's a weakness of ours. We haven't figured out how to take that on. And then if you look at the socioeconomic inequities that we have as the bottom third of the American workforce, the bottom third of family incomes, there's not a single positive indicator in 110 million people in the United States. Lifespan is going down, income is going down, educational attainment is going down. And so for us in the academic sector, we better step up here, and all of us in our different environments that we're operating, we've got to change our behaviors, change what we're doing. And the pandemic is sort of all these things accelerated into a single visual moment. a single emotional moment. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity to move things in new ways, move out some of the old things like Sean was talking about. We have bad public policies, bad designs, all kinds of things. And we need to look at this moment and take it very serious. We should not think we're just going to weather this storm.
Right.
We should see this as a broader social climate shift that we've got to work our way into rather than just a storm we're trying to work our way through.
Well, and I think the other crisis that's been growing and really has come to come to a boil in the past few months is a crisis of trust and confidence in institutions that has really hit a low point across the board. And there's been a declining confidence in higher education as a sector and higher education institutions for some time. And when you combine that with the impact of the pandemic, the impact of the economic crisis, the reckoning about racial injustice, and a sense that these are all failures of our institutions and higher education being part of that, I think that to build on Michael's point, we not only need to find ways to take on these issues and to be out in front and leading them, but to do that in a way that's also going to rebuild the trust in higher education and rebuild sort of trust in institutions that needs to happen if any of us are going to continue to thrive moving forward.
I want to build on that point. I think it's a really important observation. And I just want to acknowledge the irony that has suddenly occurred to me that we're having this discussion about inclusion, and I'm having it with 3 chief executives, right? The top head people in certain ways at your institutions. And there's questions that have come in that have kind of alluded to different parts of this, but if you're going to create a sense of belonging, as you referred to, Sean, in a more horizontal way, right? Not that the people in charge are going to welcome these other people in to do exactly what the people in charge have been doing all along, versus people have asked questions about first of all, how do students of color and other underrepresented students feel welcomed into the work of making their institutions more fair without feeling burdened by that work or singled out for that work. Same question for faculty. How do they, faculty that come from underrepresented populations, how do they feel empowered to speak up and have a voice and not feel burdened by that work of making their institutions more fair? And how do you share the power, going forward to make your institutions more fair?
There's a really interesting program that I heard about day before yesterday at the University of California at Santa Cruz that has been struggling with a kind of not very virtuous cycle of incident, demonstration, unsuccessful resolution. And what they're starting to do, which I think is just a fascinating model, I'm eager to try it at Berkeley, is to create work groups, a faculty or staff member as the leader of the group, but then have groups of students work on some social problem at the institution, and they're paid for that work. So it's being paid for their labor. And then they come up with a set of solutions and present them to the administration at the end of this process. And I've been thinking more and more about how do we create different kinds of roles for our students to participate in the work of institutional transformation.
So what I would add to that is that, and this is something that we've done here at ASU, which is to change ourselves from a common general issue regional public university operating in a bureaucratic model, implementing political instructions and bureaucratic instructions. We've transformed ourselves into an institution designed around the idea of social transformation. And so once you take on social transformation as the objective of the institution, you connect it to social transformation for what? In our case, to the attainment of the philosophical ideals on which the country is based. And what I found when you do that, and we've been at this a while, you engage the faculty in a different way, a less bureaucratic way, a less argumentative way, the students in the same way. And so I'm not suggesting that other universities don't have the same purpose, but we have this as a stated charter, a stated reason for our existence. Inclusion and equity are in our charter. And so therefore you can measure the institution and anyone in it, the students, the faculty, the staff, the leadership of the institution against the social transformation outcomes. And at least for us, that has been a powerfully enabling design addition for us. That's allowed us to take on a new kind of structural trajectory, a new kind of, we're measuring ourselves against the philosophical aspirations of the democracy itself. Now, this might sound highfalutin, but it turns out that it actually works because our arguments shifted from resource arguments between the sciences and the humanities and this or that, and to the notion of how do we all work together to achieve these objectives. And so from our perspective, it has been a way to deal with what you called this irony. And so, we have different roles and different functions, but we're all driven towards the same social transformation objectives.
Well, and I think that there are some important things that we can all do to make sure that that creating a more equitable institution is seen as everyone's work. And I think that shared governance, I like to think not only of shared governance, but actually shared responsibility, right? That it's a commitment that everyone at the institution has to make and contribute to transform the institution. And so we've tried that in a few different angles. One is thinking about the role of faculty, which at a school like Kenyon is really central, both because of we have faculty who tend to be have long careers at our institution, are committed to the institution in a deep way, and also have very close connections with students. A couple of years ago, and actually in a project that originated with an Hhmi grant, the faculty voted to make as a part of promotion and tenure guidelines on campus that you actually had to demonstrate that all faculty have to demonstrate how they are advancing inclusive excellence on campus in a positive way. So it's not seen as this is an extra thing that gets measured in your evaluation, but it's actually seen as kind of core and critical to the work that you do. That if you're coming to Kenyon and you're coming to Kenyon to be an excellent teacher at Kenyon means a teacher that's committed to inclusive excellence in the classroom and helping to build that in throughout the community. And that changes the expectation in some really critical ways, because I think now it's everyone's responsibility, not the responsibility of the few that may be committed to social justice, not the responsibility of faculty of color, but everyone has a demonstrated responsibility to show that they are doing work in advancing this forward, and the institution is holding people accountable for that, and that's important. I think on another track, the idea that we need to make sure that all members of the community have some education outside of their regular, for students outside of their regular classroom education. I think for faculty and staff, kind of continued education to understand the nature of systemic racism and how you combat it. And so we've made an effort this year to bring that to all members of the community, including our board of trustees. And so, our board has started a program of education and anti-racism. We're involving students and faculty and staff in that in a number of different ways. And I think that's important. And then I think a third thing that we're trying this year is to make funds available for projects in all parts of the community. So kind of calling for innovation from students, from faculty, from staff, and especially collaborations across those to come forward with ideas about what can transform the community to make it more inclusive, but also to challenge systemic racism. And again, kind of spread out the possibility and to generate some broader space for innovation and broader space for shared responsibility.
It's complex work. It goes on at a lot of different levels. So I have one more question, and then we have a lot of great questions from the audience. And we touched on it a few times, but we're living through this historic downturn in enrollment in colleges right now. That's clearly a result of all of these disruptions of the pandemic. And how does that affect your pursuit of not only the students that are part of your community, but the students that are not part of your community? How do you bring them in the fold, get them to recommit to higher education?
So we have a 7.3% enrollment increase this semester over last year. So we're not experiencing that, but nonetheless, the point is well taken. And that is, how do we make certain that we're able to keep on track all of the students who would and need to attend college as a part of moving their lives forward on lots of different fronts. And so, at least from our perspective, it means constant adaptation and constant outreach. And working with them in new ways and breaking down some of I don't know, I don't want to be glib, which I sometimes am, and I'm criticized for that sometimes. So I'm going to try not to be glib here. You know, the whole notion of the rigidity of our structure, you know, a semester is this long. Well, why is it that long? You know, the summer school is a certain kind of thing. Well, why is it that? Why is it not something else? And, you know, we've made a lot of changes in making the institution more approachable while still having structure and still having process. And that has allowed us to greatly enhance the flow, particularly of first generation students coming to us and Pell eligible students coming to us, because we've just found ways to be less rigid. And I think that that's ever more important in the moment in time that we're in right now for lots of different reasons.
Yeah, I think that we have to think about enrollment without the kind of rigidities that have structured it so often. And now there's tremendous need for what's sometimes called upskilling in the economy. And colleges and universities have been less involved in that than they should be. So we're thinking about enrollment increases in virtually every category of enrollment that we have. I think it's critical at this moment to be extending more educational opportunity to our many publics.
No, and I'd agree. I think that, you know, one of the outcomes of the responses that we've all had to make to the pandemic is that it's been a driver to be less rigid. You know, that it would, you know, the things like the academic calendar in a typical year would be considered sacred and almost impossible to change. And in the past year, often and readily, right? That there's some ways in which we are learning or developing some comfort with more flexibility, which is good. I also think, though, that there are opportunities to strengthen collaborations with, you know, for Kenyon with high schools, which has been a long time set of collaborations where we've worked to offer Kenyon College courses at high schools throughout Ohio. You know, this is a moment where that's becoming more important than ever. And so we're looking at how we can strengthen and expand that. But then also, what are the ways that we can work more creatively with partner institutions, community colleges, research institutions? And, you know, some of the rigidity is just, I think eventually we also just have to let go of what we think of as enrollment. You know, that there is and I think this gets amplified in the higher ed press to some degree as well, right? That there's a real horse race scorekeeping around kind of what your yield has been and what's your number at late August, and kind of the, you know, that's tied into a whole host of things around rankings and things. If we're really going to have a system that's truly more flexible, where students might be in and out and they might be jumping between different types of institutions, it means we're also just going to have to let go of some of the traditional ways that we sort of think about what enrollment actually means and how we measure that and how we compare that to each other.
That's great. So please feel free to continue putting questions in the Q&A. And I'm going to start to go through them. There's a couple questions about belonging, and I guess I would like to hear more about this as well. What is the work of belonging? How do you do it internally? How do you prompt it internally? I guess you can't really control people's minds, but yeah. And one of these questions is directed right at you, Michael. How have you created belonging in your community?
Yeah, so for us, it's belonging around our purpose and our intent. And so, are you here only for yourself as a faculty member? Are you a mercenary faculty member just looking for the best equipment, the best lab, the best library, the best whatever? Are you here as a student only for yourself? Are you here for your family and your community? And so we work to create belonging around the idealized objectives of the institution. You know, why we are here. We are here to make a better society, and we will measure ourselves against our progress towards that goal. And everyone's here for that reason. The student, we have as a part of our belonging purpose, the notion of taking responsibility for the community. So we live in Arizona, which is, you know, virtually a pioneer state in many ways. We're figuring stuff out here. You know, we're moving in new directions. And so if something's not being successful, like K-12 education is not where we would like it to be, are we responsible for that or not? And the second that you say that we are, you belong to an organization which is owning things that transform society. So for us, the sense of belonging is to the idealized purpose of the institution. And I would also say, no tongue in cheek, you know, to the ongoing 400 years of the Enlightenment. Either we are driving our species forward into the liberal capital L world, you know, of individual rights and individual liberties and justice and equality, or we aren't. There's only two outcomes, and we've just gone through a long experience here of the last few years where there's a lot of questioning about whether or not we're going to move on that path. We're on that path, we're moving forward, and you want to create a sense of belonging around those two things, the purpose of the institution and where we're taking our society. And we really work very, very heavily on that.
What about
I think that fostering a sense of belonging has also a lot to do with listening and with how you place voices in the institution to talk about different experiences, that it has to do with not assuming that there is just one identity within the institution, but there are many identities, and you use all of the, you know, tools that people who are heads of institutions have, from how you write about things, how you speak about things, the kinds of public programming you put on, but also just who you listen to, that starts changing the sense of what constitutes the community.
I agree with that. That's very important.
And, you know, related to that, I think that, you know, some of the hard work of belonging is taking a look at things like, you know, traditions and ways in which the institutions have typically operated, and culture in places, right? And this gets to sort of the difference between inclusion and belonging. I think, you know, inclusion is the sense of, I think of it very simplistically of, do you find ways to invite people into the existing culture? The work of belonging is actually asking the question, are there things about the culture that should change in order to make sure that everyone can feel a part of it? And, you know, that is what makes that hard work. Is it means taking a close and sometimes painful look at the institution itself, and its, you know, its history, its legacy, the origins of particular types of traditions and functions, and, you know, being willing to do that is not easy, but I think to move towards that sense of belonging, that's part of the work that has to be done, and it takes a while. You know, that's also something that's a long-term process, right? It's something that doesn't happen very quickly.
We have a question about scale, and there's really two questions that are related, sort of about class size and resources, and being parts of institutions that are having to increase class size because of budget issues, and the impact that that has on quality of relationships and the ability to, you know, create a feeling of inclusion. How do you all navigate that?
Well, I think that, you know, I actually think it's one of the advantages of the pandemic is that we're not limited by room size, for how big a class needs to be, but you have to, in every class, balance the big and the small, so that I don't think it matters a lot if a lecture class is 600 students versus 500 students, what does matter is whether there are discussion sections, breakout groups, some smaller structure that's also part of the learning experience that enables students to connect to either a graduate student instructor or, and obviously to each other in a smaller way. So I don't think that it's actually one of the liberating things about the pandemic is to be able to have very large lecture classes, but they're not effective unless you can also have a combination, a variety of more intimate, smaller experiences for students.
Yeah, what I can say about class size, being at an institution that has, I don't know, 62,000 undergraduates on campus, and as many other undergraduates online, is that we a long time ago decided that classes needed to be designed for the success of the students, whatever that design is. And so if it's a lyric opera program in our music school, those classes are going to be very, very intimate. And if it's a general anthropology course where I'm learning about Australopithecus, I could learn that with the right, as Carol says, the right TAs and the right help and the right study groups and so forth. In a big class, it could be almost infinitely scaled if I had the right support mechanisms. And so for us, the approach that we've taken is something we didn't take before. We used to be mechanized and machine-like and thinking about 20 students per class and this and this and this, and until we changed freshman math. So in freshman math, we realized that our 20 to 30 student sections, without the kind of adaptive learning tools that we were able to build and put in place computationally assisting the learning process, we were getting inadequate outcomes. We then changed the class size, actually grew it to 125 students, greatly enhanced the computational assistance and the structure to the students. And now we have mastered the ability to get our students to the level of math understanding that we need to get them to. And so what we did was we gave up on the simple notion that everything needed to be small, and the notion that some things need to be small, some things can be infinitely large, everything needs to be custom. Now that's very different than Kenyon, where you're creating this unique kind of learning environment. And we've built some of those environments inside the university also, where there's very intimate learning environments inside many of our programs. And so basically the old notion of class size and average class size and faculty to student ratio, those are less meaningful as an indicator of what you're actually doing than actually the outcomes that you can produce.
And I feel this is one where Kenyon's a place where our range of scale is so different than the other institutions. I think that it's but to underscore what Michael's saying, that I do believe that what makes for a high quality educational experience is the intention and design of the learning environment, as opposed to the scale itself, right? And that you can, with investment of resources and with intention, you can create a high quality learning environment at a range of different scales. At Kenyon, we have chosen to do it in a very intimate scale, but I think that that's not, I'm also a believer that's not the only way in which one creates that type of learning environment.
Yeah. There's a question I want to read in its entirety because it's challenging, from an anonymous person. It says, how do you recognize the contributions of faculty of color who have been working in an inequitable environment that leaves them at lower ranks, unheard, with lower salaries? How do you improve the racialized climate these faculty manage from students and faculty alike, and particularly in STEM disciplines?
Well, what I'll say to that question is, by taking that question and basically assuming it's all true, which I think it largely is, and then advancing in a new way. So we have a number of issues that we're working on right now as we're trying to look back at our own systemic racism. We're trying to look at our own structural constraints that we put in place. We're trying to deal with this issue of invisible work, where we have minority faculty members who have extra engagement with students who are coming to them wanting help, wanting advice. And so it basically, to the root of the question It's basically by assuming that's true and then working to correct it in every possible way that we can. And it's a long process. It's a difficult process, but it's basically you have to operate under the assumption that the institutions are not what we aspire to be, and we have a long way to go, and we need to make a number of systemic changes.
We do lots of salary equity studies and correct things that we discover. The problem, I think, is a much more difficult one about a racialized climate, particularly in STEM disciplines. So we're just trying to interrogate right now what it would mean, not just to be a diverse institution or an inclusive institution or an equitable institution. What does it mean to be an anti-racist institution?
No, and I think this from the institution's perspective, I think there needs to be an continual emphasis that support for our students of color, support to becoming a more inclusive anti-racist institution is everyone's work and responsibility. And so that requires us to keep two things that can feel in tension at top of mind at the same time. One is that it's important for us, we have an imperative to work towards diversifying our faculty, because diversifying our faculty will provide the role models that will help to make the science departments and majors more inclusive and will help to kind of lead to that larger transformation. And I think we can't deny that diversifying faculty is a key piece of that. Yet at the same time, we have to hold forth that it's not the responsibility of the people that we hire to carry out and achieve that more diverse and inclusive sense in our science departments, that it's actually the work of everyone. And I think institutions can do that in part by promotion, tenure, evaluation, salary guidelines, and making sure that not only are people rewarded for work that is sometimes unseen, but that people who aren't doing that unseen work are not rewarded, right? That I think it has to work both ways as we are implementing it. And it has to be an institutional priority to ensure that the outcomes, and especially in the STEM disciplines, actually, that change actually happens. And so that there's it's not just a matter of, well, we've hired a couple of faculty, so we're done. It's got to be an institutional focus that there's ongoing continual work there.
There's a very good question about how do you create a more equitable institution when the cost of college keeps rising?
We're working pretty hard for it not to keep rising. So, we have 8 years where we've kept our average tuition increase at 1.7%. We've promised to keep the in-state tuition increases to less than 3% and as close to zero as possible for 10 years into the future. So that'll give us a 20-year window. And so we're working hard on every possible front to contain the cost to the student. And we've also said, and I'll say it again publicly, there will be no student who can't come to this institution for a financial reason. We will find the resources for the student to complete the institution's programs. And we've been doing that relentlessly. And so we're trying to contain both. We understand this is a problem. We understand this is an issue. We understand that we have to find a way to be excellent and to move forward while containing costs at the same time.
I agree with Michael, but I think we also have to be so energetic in advocating for the state support that has disappeared from or greatly diminished at so many of our institutions. That the cost drivers are a little bit different in privates and publics, but certainly in publics, the most important driver of the increase in tuition has been a decrease in state support.
Sure.
And I think this is, so again, a place where Kenyon is the school that's a bit different than the others in terms of both scale and cost and the relationship of state support. For us, I think that cost containment is really important. So finding ways to keep down the growth in tuition, yet at the same time, finding ways to make sure that we're prioritizing financial aid and need-based financial aid as a part of the budget. And I'd say some of that is also financial aid that's not only addressing issues of tuition and helping in access in that way. But how do we also make sure that we are appropriately resourcing what are the needs to make sure that students are successful, right? And that's a balance that we have to keep in mind. That said, the business model for private small colleges is challenging. I mean, it's really a model that's based on the fact that some students will be paying full tuition, and that we can use a portion of that full tuition to build the infrastructure, which will help us be more accessible in terms of resources to support students with need. And that's a model that's increasingly difficult to navigate.
Absolutely. I want to get to at least two more of these questions. I think they're really good ones. This one pertains to STEM disciplines in particular. What has been done to include diverse scientists and voices in the curriculum? What has been done to restructure incentive systems for faculty and staff? How have you identified ways to recognize the unseen and draining work done by women and minority faculty? Please list examples. I guess this is an exam question. Show your work.
Well, these are critically important things. I mean, what we did was we basically decided that our designs were all flawed, that we couldn't get the kind of diversity outcomes that we needed to get in the existing structures, and so we altered all structures. We literally eliminated the geology department, all kinds of departments. We created new schools, a school for Earth and space exploration. We eliminated every department in engineering and built 5 grand challenge schools of engineering and a polytechnic school in engineering. Now, I won't walk you through the 30 or 40 things we did in this space, but we started at the design level. And the outcome then has been an infinitely more diverse faculty, an infinitely more diverse student body, a growing student body, a growing number of majors. We have 40,000 STEM majors on campus now. We used to have 10,000. And those are, several times larger in terms of numbers, but they're infinitely larger in terms of diversity. We're not where we'd like to get yet in terms of faculty diversity outside of gender. We've been making huge progress on gender equity and gender diversification within our STEM faculty, and we need to move into, ethnic diversity more than we have, particularly among Blacks and Hispanics, and we're working towards that. But you have to start with the design, and so we just blew up the design and started over.
We've found, and I agree with both Michael and Sean, that the diversity of the faculty is absolutely key to this effort in curriculum, as well as in creating a sense of belonging for a diverse student body. And we've started doing a few things that have been very successful in creating more diverse outcomes in our faculty searches. One is to do a number of searches in a very, very broad category. So rather than saying we want a specialist in some very particular area, we say we are going to hire 5 positions in engineering. And the other thing we do is something similar to what Sean was talking about before in promotions. We strongly urge that every search require diversity statements from all its candidates.
And I say that a key thing to making sure that unseen work gets recognized is finding ways to make it seen. So making sure that the systems of evaluation and mentoring, especially of junior faculty, give good guidance about balancing work, but also have mechanisms to make sure that all aspects of faculty work are seen and accounted for. And again, and say that we need to make sure, to me, it's imperative that doing that work, so being attentive to building an inclusive culture in an academic department or in a classroom should be our minimum requirements for teaching, right? That should actually be something that's an expectation of what it means to teach well, not just seen as something that's an added bonus. Because I think when we get into the mode of that's an extra thing that someone does, that does put us down the slippery slope of thinking of it as unseen or creating something that's unseen or unrewarded labor. It really should be something that's just the basic expectation that everyone does. We are working towards, I think the next step for us is making sure that we can measure that effectively and to have good means of measuring that in evaluation. But when I look down the road of what's going to make long-term systemic change, that has to be a key part of it.
I'm just writing down all these great ideas and piling them up over here. So I appreciate just listening to the two of you to get these great ideas. So.
I do want to get to this question, which is important for another dimension of diversity and equity and inclusion, which is gender. The data clearly indicates that the pandemic has disproportionately affected women. They're leaving the workforce in droves. Research productivity for your faculty, how do you address this at your institutions for tenure review and in so many other ways?
Well, we've extended the tenure clock for anyone who wants that extension because of the pandemic. We've made more childcare resources available to faculty, but it's not nearly adequate to the need. I think this is a huge problem, and it is falling disproportionately on women's shoulders. We also created a pool of money to which faculty could apply, whose research is really being affected by the kinds of challenges of the pandemic.
It is a very serious issue. One of the things that we know we need to do, so we've done away with the male-centric tenure clock idea of the last 150 years, 200 years. We've basically, people are on individual paths that are reflective of their life circumstances, not just extensions during the pandemic, but very significant extensions for child raising and all kinds of other things that are really important. And the other thing that we've done just in the sciences, our fantastic Dean of Science, Nancy Gonzalez, has just hired a new woman to head our School of Earth and Space Exploration, a new woman to lead our Department of Physics, a new woman to lead our School of Mathematical and Statistical Sciences, and a new woman to lead our School of Molecular Sciences. And so it's also breaking the logic of the way that these parts of the institution have been managed in the past, and bringing in a new logic, a more reflexive logic, a more understanding logic, and this moving away from this way that institutions in the past have just been heartless, totally unequivocally heartless. No longer the case here.
And just one dimension that I'd add to this, that this is another place where our institutional, both our institutional policies, but maybe even more importantly, our institutional aspirations are running up against kind of hard walls of failures in broader national, regional public policy. And I think the impact of the pandemic on childcare and schooling is a good example of that. We've really, just to be honest, we've struggled a lot with trying to figure out how to be as flexible as our aspirations of being supportive to all employees. That's really what we want to do on campus. How to do that, yet realize that the instability in childcare and schooling right now is just enormous, right? And that there are just real, figuring out how to navigate that is something that I wish I could say we've made progress in, but it's been a real struggle. And for us, I'd say the most important thing has been encouraging everyone to keep lines of communication open, sort of understanding that the institution has to be flexible when needs come up, and that as needs change and evolve as they do regularly, and try to find ways to be supportive, kind of both big and small. But I think it's just another point where I think the pandemic has really brought some larger structural issues that reach beyond our institution to the fore, and figuring out how to solve those has been difficult.
You mean you can't fix all of society from your office there?
I would love it actually to just figure out, equitable childcare in a pandemic would be amazing.
That would be great.
Figure that out. That would be terrific.
So I want to close with the question about, actually there's two questions here that are kind of interesting in opposition. One of them is, do you find yourself being more publicly outspoken on especially racial issues than you might have been a few years ago? I would say that I am. And how do you reconcile or manage board members who do not agree with this position? So that's one hand, talking the talk. And then someone else came in and said, you know, not to be a downer, but you sound like you're all doing a really great job. So why does this problem still exist? How do we reconcile? How do we reconcile the reality versus the press release? So talking the talk and walking the walk. How do you guys address these two sides?
Well, in terms of more publicly outspoken, I mean, unequivocally, I mean, if university and college presidents can't be outspoken, they shouldn't be in the job. If they're worried about their board or getting fired, they should just get fired. And so I have this view. I mean, George Floyd was murdered by an inadequately trained police department who had obviously no value of human life, and racists engaged in the implementation of their work. All those things need to be fixed and changed, and we have to speak about those things. We have to speak up about those things. And to the second question, there's no patting on the back here. I mean, the reason that we have these problems, the reasons that we have inadequately trained police, inadequately designed police, insufficiently public safety directed police, insufficient social work engagement with police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is because we at the universities haven't done our job well enough. I actually say if we just put some of the burden back on us, our minds will become focused. And so there's no patting on the back. We're just reporting in from the battlefield. And so there's no patting on the back here. We have a lot to do, and we haven't done a lot of things right, and we're going to have to get them done a lot better going forward.
Yes, I find myself more outspoken. Our Board of Regents actually is very outspoken on these issues too, so there isn't any conflict there. But I agree with Michael. I think you have to speak truly to your convictions in order to be able to lead effectively. And this is an upward arc, and we spend a lot of time interrogating our history. And we've been renaming a number of buildings lately, just to try to expose where we have fallen short, but always keep the trajectory upward.
And I've tried to be consistently outspoken, so I don't know if that has changed one way or the other over the course of the past few months. But I do want to address this notion of where the challenges are and how the reality and the press release might differ, because and I should say, speaking personally, I know I've been speaking a lot today in terms of what our institutional values and aspirations are, but the real work comes in how you move the institution closer to achieving those values and aspirations. And the reality is that so we are if we take students and employees all in, we're about 2,400 people who are all at very different places in their own personal movement along sort of more equitable, just view of the world, and more equitable and just sort of personal perspective. I count myself among that. So I think I am constantly learning on a regular basis of how injustice exists both close by and in a larger context. And the one thing I can say is that the piece that gives me hope is that we're all committed to doing the work. But that doesn't mean that on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis, year-to-year basis, there are not still huge issues, both small and systemic, that we are trying to work against. And so, I've yet to find an institution that has solved these issues, but I do know that there are many that at least recognize them and are trying to work and move towards them. And I think that's at least the piece that I've been aiming for.
Okay. I mean, if universities can't learn as institutions, what institutions can, right? I'm going to throw it to Rich. Thank you all so much. It's been really inspiring to be in conversation with each of you and to hear about the challenges that you're facing, and just the prospect of leadership that's aligned with values feels like a good moment to invoke the importance of that. So thank you all.
Thank you, Anya.
Thank you, Anya.
Thank you, Anya. We've reached the end of today's stimulating discussion. I'd like to extend HHMI's sincere appreciation to our moderators and to our panelists, both this panel and the first one. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for having tuned in and participated with your questions. The recording of the webinar will be available on HHMI's YouTube channel. Wish everyone a good day and a good weekend.